The same is true for the chat that we have. Just add any questions that you have. And maybe already you have some expectations or you want some questions answered, then you can type them in now, and Gerald will moderate that and make sure that I answer all those questions. So if you have any question now, which question would you like to see answered, then please take some time to type that in, and I can come back to that during my presentation. In the meantime, I'll just go on and explain basically what the basic idea behind the book is. And the basic idea is that we're moving fast towards an information society. So more and more of our work is driven by information, and an information society is actually defined as a society in which the gathering and processing and dissemination of information has become the most important economic activity. And that is something new. I mean, we come from basically an industrial or even a service-driven society. And if we go all the way back in history, and you can see it on this picture, then we had the big industrial conglomerates. And maybe you know what the building is on the left hand of the picture. But that's the head office of General Motors on Fifth Avenue in New York. And General Motors, of course, is this huge industrial organization. And these industrial organizations used organizational forms that were very hierarchical. So they developed the organizational forms of the business unit, the divisional form, the matrix organization. And you can actually see, if you look at the building, that it kind of depicts the organizational form. There's a lot of hierarchy. You see, it's a very tall building. It's also very closed. It doesn't look inviting. It kind of says, okay, don't come in unless you work here. And that indeed was the idea of these organizational forms that emerged in the industrial era. Because the idea was we need to do everything ourselves, because then we can optimize our production processes and we can create economies of scale, and then we can produce a lot of products against a nice price so that a lot of people are able to buy them. So economies of scale were essential in the industrial era. And you kind of see that back, that efficiency orientation in the building. Now, if we look at the right-hand side, we see the new design for the Microsoft campus in Seattle. And that's a completely different thing. And Microsoft, of course, is really an information firm. And there you don't see that hierarchy anymore. The buildings are flat. And it's also an open campus. It's meant for people to share ideas, to meet each other and to exchange their knowledge in a much more open atmosphere. So instead of having these closed buildings where everybody's locked in their own specific unit or department, you're trying to open up things so that people meet each other and come up with more creative ideas. That means less hierarchy, but it also means being open for other organizations. So on these campuses, you may also have startup firms that aren't even technically part of your own organization, but you still want to have them around because they can help you innovate, because they may start a new platform or they develop interesting ways to think about algorithms, etc., etc. Now, the organizational model of the industrial time also applied to most of the service companies that we have today. If you walk into a big accountancy firm or a big bank, for example, or an insurance company, you will still see that same organizational structure with lots of hierarchy, business units, and a lot of different departments, and not so much oriented towards innovation. And so we're still trying to leave that model behind and trying to invent new organizational forms that better fit with the information era. Now, and that's kind of the background of the story that's also in the book. And this is my short agenda for today. I'll first discuss in a little bit more detail of the things that are going on in the business environment. To understand also, is this a hype or is this not a hype? All the talk about self-organization and agile. Then I'll dive into an example, the Spotify model as implemented in ING, which is one of the leading Dutch banks and also one of the bigger banks worldwide. I'll go into self-organization and the Holocracy model. Holocracy has also become very popular over the past couple of years. And then somewhere around 11 o'clock, maybe a bit later, we'll have a 10-minute break. And after the break, I'll discuss some platform-based ecosystems with an example of Booking.com. And I'll end up with the latest model that has gotten a lot of attention in the literature and also in business. And that's hires Rendanheyi. And connected to that, we also have a short case study and a breakout in groups around how you could implement a Rendanheyi model in John Deere, the producer of agricultural equipment. Throughout, we have some polls and some opportunities for discussion. And once again, if there's anything you want to know or isn't clear, please put it in the chat, and Gerald will make sure that those questions end up with me. Well, you can also find these organizational forms in the book, except for the last one. The Rendanheyi is really new. We have a couple of other things in the book, but it really guides you through all these organizational forms and tells you when they work and when they don't work. And I think this masterclass is just a very good introduction to it, and at least you get a good and quick overview of all these organizational forms. So some more background. As you may know, a lot of the management literature may be susceptible to quite some hype. If you walk into a physical bookstore and you go to the management books department, then you also see stacks of books with all kinds of new terms and people trying to promote their ideas. And it's often very difficult to understand, okay, is this something serious, or is this, just a flimsy idea somebody made up and you shouldn't apply it in your own company? Well, I think that if we look at many of the new organizational forms that are emerging, that there is a long-term trend behind it that means that this is not a hype. But I'm also always cautious. There never is one good solution that fits for every organization. So every organization will have to find out which model works for me, and also how do I have to adapt that model a little bit. So one core message is there is no one best way of organizing. Agile is interesting, but it doesn't work for all organizations. Platforms, interesting, but it doesn't work for all organizations. So always be aware of that. There's no one best way of organizing. Look at the different organizational forms that are out there, choose one that fits best with you, and also then adapt it to your own needs. I think we certainly see a lot of interest in these new organizational forms now in the COVID era, because that forces us also to decentralize, to work more online. Your boss is not in the office every day anymore telling you what to do or watching what you're doing. People have to act more independently, and that fits very well with some of the new organizational models that have emerged recently. So if we want to know if something is a hype or not, we always need to look at the history. And one of my favorite authors is Alfred Chandler, who's wrote a lot about the history of business. And he came up with the formula, structure follows strategy, but the market is the common denominator. And what he means by that is, look, the market, the outside world is the most important. There's a lot going outside organizations in terms of technology, changing customer demands, changing regulations, etc. And that forces organizations to change their strategy. You need to think about what those changes in the environment mean for your organization. If your organization has to survive, you need to have a strategy that adapts to what is going on in the outside world. And then once you've figured out that strategy, you need to come up with different structures, with different new organizational forms. Hence, structure follows strategy. And over time, we've seen a lot of organizational forms. I already mentioned a few. This is a very complex picture from the book. I will not go through it, so don't be afraid. Don't get scared by this. This just explains the history of different organizational forms as they have developed over the past 100 years or so. I started with the business unit, which was developed in 1923 by General Motors. Obviously, before 1923, also a lot of interesting things happened, but I think that's not so interesting for us now. The business unit is still very relevant, and if you look at many different organizations today, you still see parts of that business unit that are present there. But because the environment changed, the economy grew, clients had different demands, and new technologies came up, you see that a lot of different new organizational forms have emerged over time. And if we look completely on the right-hand side, the heading of information society, you see a lot of new organizational forms that have emerged, and we deal with most of those in the book. And you see they also build of each other. Huh? They need the precursors in order to So that's a brief overview of the history of organizational forms. And you can also understand, if you look at the right-hand side of the picture, that there's a lot of confusion in managers about what all these terms mean and which organizational form should we pick. And unfortunately, when something becomes too hype and too much of a hype, or when managers get too enthusiastic about one organizational form, they sometimes just pick the wrong form. So we try to guide you this morning a little bit through all these different forms. And so why do we see the trend towards these new organizational forms? Well, as I explained earlier, we were first very interested in creating economies of scale and scope, producing things at low cost or delivering services at low cost. But now it's much more important to innovate and to be fast, to have speed. Because technology development is so fast and new startups come up all over the place in places that you haven't heard of, and they may really compete with your business as well. So in order to react to that, you need to increase your speed and your innovation capacity. We also used to focus on physical products. Now there's information goods. That also means you can organize your work differently. When you have a physical product, only 2 or 3 people can work on one car on an assembly line at the same time. But with an information good, millions of people can log into a database at the same time. So that means that you can organize work differently. You can have people working on one piece of information or on one software package jointly at the same time, whereas with physical goods that wasn't possible. We also had a huge focus on shareholder value or meeting our budgets, but we also see that there are now big societal problems that as organizations we also need to take into account. And so the environment or health issues at the moment, of course, are very important. We also need to help solve those problems. And that's what we need to create shared value. It's not just making our shareholders richer, which is still important and a good driver for business, of course, but there's also a lot of demand of thinking about the environment or about health, about well-being of people at work, to avoid burnout or stress. Those kind of things are also more and more important and need to be incorporated in your strategy. And it also requires different ways of working. The workforce has become more highly educated. Well, I don't have to explain that, I think, to the people in Singapore. The majority of you are from Singapore. Singapore has seen a tremendous development over the past half century. And of course, the level of education has risen substantially. I think you're now in each list that we see about top ranking education. Singapore is very high on that list. And that also means that you can organize work differently. If people don't have that much education and are not that much able to think for themselves, then maybe they need a boss to tell them what to do. But if people are highly educated, they can see where the problems are, they can understand them, they can analyze them, and they can come up with a solution. So that also requires less hierarchy. And finally, technologies has changed from more standalone technologies to integration of technologies, where we see different pieces of software and hardware and apps that need to come together in order to build a certain service for the clients. So all those things together require us to think about new organizational forms. And because of these trends, I think that overall the attention for these organization forms is not a hype, but a long-term development lies behind it. Okay, I'd like to go now to a first example, unless there are any questions, Gerald. I don't know, then just interrupt me. But
yeah, there's nothing showing up on the chat yet. I think people are still absorbing.
Good. Yeah. So, I'll take that to mean that I was clear in my explanation then. So a first model I'd like to discuss is the Spotify model as implemented by the ING bank. And ING is, I think, a well-known bank in many countries. But they've gone through a big digital transformation, kind of similar to the DBS Bank that you have in Singapore, which won a lot of awards, and there's been written quite a lot about how DBS Bank went through their digital transformation. And I think it was even voted world's best digital bank at one point in time. And ING went through a similar exercise, a similar transformation. And in order to do that, to digitize, they started looking at all kinds of organizations to get some inspiration about how they should organize for this digital transformation. And they found Spotify, and they thought, okay, that Spotify model is very interesting to us. Because that already is a digital firm with their online music store, and maybe we can use that in our IT department. Now, it's not so easy to get to that because ING has a long history, I think similar to DBS Bank, which also has been around for, I think, half a century. And ING also has roots that go back, I think, even further than that. And was a very traditional bank with a lot of hierarchical layers. And at once they want to move to a very flexible, agile type of model. So a question I have for you to think about is, what obstacles for implementation do you think ING encountered when they wanted to move to a very flexible organization? So this was very hierarchical. It had 9 layers of management. And in the end, it ended up with only 3 layers of management. So what kind of obstacles for implementation do you think ING encountered? And maybe you can just enter a couple of words in the chat, and then I'll explain the ING case, and we'll see how they dealt with these obstacles for implementation.
Okay, so Ard-Pieter, Bill and Maish have questions, but I'm going to let everyone fill in the answer to this question on the slide that you have here first. As I recall, when you're sharing your screen, you're not able to see the chat, right? Would you like me to
No,
read out for you?
I'm not able to see it.
Okay, right. So answers are coming in. Some of the obstacles for implementation could be legacy systems,
Yeah,
resistance from staff at levels which were eliminated.
yeah,
That would be very high. Resistance from long-time top managers,
yeah,
management buy-in, uh, difficulty in holding people accountable for their work,
yeah,
silos between different groups, onboarding people to the new organization form,
mm,
processes, roles and process alignment, the mindset change to the new way of working,
yeah,
or sometimes they don't have enough success stories or burning platform to drive the change. There could be high turnover. Some do not know where or how to start.
yeah,
Then there's a localization because there are different cultures in different countries and they need to adapt differently.
yeah. Okay. That's actually a pretty good list, and I'll get back to some of those points when I explain the model. But certainly, I think if ING were to draw up a list of the problems they encountered, I think all of these would be on that list. Well, let me get back to some of the things later, and I'll explain when I explain the case study and how they did it, also how they dealt with these obstacles for implementation. But already I think what an important takeaway is from this very good list, because these are already, I think, over 10 points, and they're all quite big points, is that if you want to move to a new organizational form, it's not that easy to do because you have a lot of history and legacy to get rid of. And that means that most organizations will choose a longer time path to do it. They will try to do it gradually. ING took a different road. They actually did it pretty quickly, but they prepared very, very well. And to deal with one issue first, somebody also said the legacy IT systems was a very big problem. But luckily, ING already started up cleaning their IT systems and making them simpler since, I think, the late 1990s or early 2000s, which is much earlier than most banks started thinking about it. And so when they started to implement the new organization, they kind of had that luck that they already cleaned up a lot of the legacy systems and the complex IT. Because what you need for these agile organizations is indeed a very simple, basic IT structure behind it, because otherwise it doesn't work. So what did they do? This is a quote, by the way, from Nick Yu of ING, who was one of the people leading the change. And we interviewed him for our book. The interview is in the book. And he says, classical hierarchical structures will vanish. We had 7 to 9 management layers in the past, and now there are only 3. That's the board, tribe leads, and chapter leads. And I'll explain what that is later on. So ING had analyzed their industry, and they found that on the one hand, their cost level was too high. And on the other hand, new technology, there were many fintechs that were starting up. So they had to do something. And indeed, there was not a direct burning platform, as one of the attendees call it. Is there a reason to change? But it was clear for ING that if the reason to change, wasn't directly clear today, it would be very clear in, let's say, 5 years' time. The threats were clear, and the cost structure certainly also was a problem. So they said, okay, we need to bring down costs, but we also need to prepare for a much higher level of innovation. And so what they did is they made a tour around all kinds of organizations that had implemented more agile operating models. So they went to Netflix and to Google and to Spotify and other organizations to see, okay, what have they done and what would work for us? And one of the main inspirations for them was the Spotify model. And this is how the Spotify model works. It kind of divides the organization into different tribes that deal with a certain product area. And for example, in ING, a tribe could be mortgages. Another tribe could deal with savings. Yeah? So each tribe deals with a separate product that a consumer could buy. And within those tribes, they've split the tribes up. In each tribe, there are about 150 people. That's relatively stable. So 150 persons work on a new mortgage process to bring that online. And those tribes are divided into separate squads. And squads are teams of about 7 people, maybe 5, maybe 9, but somewhere in the 5 to 9 area. As a rule of thumb, we say it's 7 plus or minus 2. And those teams are very stable, so those people work together for a longer period. And they consist of people with different functional backgrounds. So you may have one person there who is good in understanding customer journeys, one who's good in security, programming security, one may know a lot about privacy, another person may be very good at testing software. So you try to have a self-contained team that can develop a separate piece of software by themselves, jointly. And kind of the leader of the team is a product owner, and a product owner defines what a certain product should look like. So for example, you may have an online experience if you're a client and you want to have a new mortgage. Then in the old days, you went to a bank, you applied for the mortgage, and then, I don't know, it kind of disappeared, and then you had to call the bank 3 weeks later to see, okay, how far are we now with the mortgage? I mean, that's not a good customer service. So what one squad could do is make something available online so that individual, a client, can actually see how far the mortgage is in the process of the bank. So it can see, okay, it has now gone through phase 1 and it's now on the desk of person 2 who needs to approve it. And then probably in 5 days you will get a call from us or we send you an email and we need more information or something like that. So as a client, you can trace the progress of your mortgage application online. A squad could develop that, and then a product owner would define how that would look, what should it look like. And then the squad would start to work and they would build it. And as soon as they would have built a version of that, they can put it online themselves. And so they don't need approval from a boss to do that, but basically they can put it online themselves. And that, of course, increases the speed of operations tremendously. So they call it the squad and tribes model. You also see the chapter model, or the chapter as an organizational element. And a chapter is really a group of people that have the same area of interest or knowledge. So for example, if you're an expert in testing, then you will be in a chapter together with other people who are good in testing software. Or if you're good in design of a website, you may be in a chapter together with a couple of other designers. And the idea behind that is that you exchange knowledge and experience and new methods that may have come up, so that you keep your knowledge up to date continuously. And a chapter is led by a chapter lead. And the chapter lead is also responsible kind of for the HR, for all the human resource related things in this model. And the main task of the chapter is to make sure that the people in their chapter, that their knowledge is up to date, that they're happy, that they're advancing their skills. So there's a lot of focus also on keeping that knowledge up to date, because obviously the knowledge in anything IT related gets outdated pretty quickly. So what you actually see is, if we compare it to a traditional organization, in a traditional organization, a manager would be responsible for the product, for the human resources, and also for the processes in his specific department. In the Spotify model, it's different because the tribe lead is responsible basically for the overall product. The chapter lead does the HR, the human resources, and the process is maintained by people in the squads. So they work according to an agile format, and there's always somebody in the teams, a scrum master or an agile coach, who's responsible for the process and making sure that all that runs well. So instead of having all those functions in one individual, here actually that is spread out across different individuals. You also see the notion of guild here in the picture, and a guild is actually an informal way of knowledge sharing, and that can be around any theme. So if you as an individual think, well, sustainability, CO2 reduction should be important for ING, we should do something with that. You can see if there are other people interested in the organization, and you can start a guild around it and start exchanging knowledge around that and coming up with ideas about how you can reduce CO2 in your daily work, for example. Now, this model works well in project-driven organizations, and particularly in IT departments to develop software. So it's really different from the old software process where we would specify what we want to have as software in advance, and then teams would start building it, and then after 1.5 years you would get the end result, and then you would say, yeah, but that's not really what I wanted. And the market has changed as well. So that model is not really applicable anymore. But with this agile model, you can continuously adapt small pieces of functionality that you can put online, test it, improve it. And if new requirements in the market come up, you can easily assign those opportunities to a squad and they can start working on it. So it works well in project-driven organizations where you have to build something new. Now, one disadvantage of this model is how do you stay coherent? And that was a problem that Spotify actually had, and ING noted it early on, and they said, okay, if we're going to do this, then we run the risk that all teams are going to move in different directions. So how do we keep the organization coherent? How do we keep everything together? And there they took a planning process that they took, I thought, from Google or from Netflix, but they work with quarterly business reviews. And so each quarter they gather all the information, both externally and internally in the organization, and they bring the representatives from those different tribes together, and they say, okay, what are your plans for the next quarter? What do we think should be done? Because things are happening in the environment. Maybe a new law has been enacted, or there's a new fintech that becomes a threat, so we need to react to that. And in a big quarterly meeting, they put all that together. They check where the dependencies are between the different squads or the different tribes. And then there may be some conflicts, but okay, what can we do in this quarter? We only have a limited amount of people. And then in a big room session where there can actually be quite a lot of people looking at all the different plans that everybody has and what needs to be done. They resolve the conflicts, preferably on the spot, sometimes a day later if it needs some more thinking, but it shouldn't last too long. So a decision has to be made and people can start working again for the next quarter. So instead of doing this yearly planning, they do it on a quarterly basis. And that just keeps the speed up and keeps it possible to react to changing circumstances in the business environment. And it keeps everybody aligned with the overall goal of ING. Now getting to this... Yeah, sorry, what's the question?
Sorry, no, that someone joined
Okay.
and didn't unmute.
Okay,
but
no.
there are some questions. Maybe I can interrupt you here. So let's go to the slide before, because I guess it's the question on Spotify model. how does this relate to functional matrix organizations?
Yeah. So the functional and the matrix organization is actually a traditional model where if you have a matrix, let's say one focusing on the product and one on the region, then you still have two managers that are completely responsible. You know, they have all responsibilities relating to the product, and they have all responsibilities relating to the region. And those responsibilities include everything. So the product responsibility, is the product profitable, the HR around that product, and the processes around that product. And the regional manager is responsible for the profitability of the region, but also for the HR in the region and for the processes in the region. And what you see here is that it's not really a matrix structure in that sense, because they've split up those different functions across different people. And one of the problems with the matrix organization is that an individual will have to report to two bosses. So the product manager and the regional manager. In this case, you don't have to do that. The individual in a squad only reports to the chapter lead. The chapter lead is basically kind of the daily manager that you report to. And next it is the chapter lead that has to coordinate with the tribe lead about certain issues. So one of the difficulties with a lot of the matrix models, if they are implemented in the pure form, is really that a lot of people are confused about what to do because they have different requirements coming from different bosses. And that leads to a lot of coordination and meetings with people to see how are we going to make this work. And here in this model, they try to avoid this by not having this dual responsibility of the individual.
Okay, so Bill also has a question. Earlier you mentioned that it's good, this Spotify model is good for creating new products that I guess are informational in nature. He asks about companies which produce, market, and sell physical products, whether these new organization models actually work for them. He said that Zappos is frequently cited as a holocracy. However, the world's most valuable company, Apple, at 2 trillion market cap, is not, as far as he knows, contemplating a new op model. Do you have comments on that?
No, I think I may have a bit more to say about it later, but so let's take the first part of the question. Yeah, does it work also in with physical products? And indeed, that's difficult. So you really see this as a model that is for the information age and for the information products. There are some organizations that are looking to apply Agile in a product environment. That's called Agile hardware. And there are a couple of organizations working on that because the thinking behind Agile can be, that is really, you can learn something from it for a product-driven organization. And one of the things that Agile is very good in is, they just build something that works and then they test it and then they improve it. Whereas in a product environment, we first tend to create a complete product and then we put it to the market and we cannot adapt it anymore. So there are some organizations now that are experimenting with these kind of organizational forms to see if they can also build physical products or in terms of having a prototype and put that on the market and get fast client feedback and then improve it again and get fast client feedback and improve it again. Now, I haven't seen this in consumer markets yet, but in business to business, that is possible. But, and you can increase the speed of innovation, but it is much more difficult and it's not as, the benefits are not as big as they are in an IT environment.
Got it.
What we do see more often, by the way, and then we come to platforms, is that we may have physical products, but we build an online platform on top of those products. And that's kind of what Apple is also partly doing. And then you can see that in one part of the organization, they have the Agile working methods, but in the production organizations, they still have the traditional, let's say, functional organization, for example.
Yeah, kind of a blended approach, if you will, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And actually, ING also has a blended approach. They only do this in the IT department. And in another part of the organization, for example, where they have client contact, they use a holocracy model. I'll explain what that is later on. So, and I think that's also a way to think about your own organization, that maybe you may have different organizational models for different parts of your organization, whereas we are always used to using one model for the entire organization. But the question is whether that is still the best option nowadays.
Yeah, Bill, I will get to your question later. So I'll take the questions that are most relevant to the slides here at the moment. So Jürgen was making a comment that modular products are growing in the B2C markets as well, enabling agile product development. I think that's just a comment on what you were sharing earlier. Florian asked the question, how does the product owner relate to the chapter and tribe lead if he does not have managerial responsibility?
Yeah, so the product owner is actually just a part of the team. So it's one of the team members. And what a product owner does together with the squad, as they call it in Spotify, is to jointly set the priorities. But of course, that's not always that easy to do. So somebody needs to make a decision sometimes about what we're going to do first, and then that is the role that is assigned to the product owner. So the product owner actually has to coordinate most with the tribe lead, because the tribe lead defines the overall product, and the product owner has to say, okay, you know, we want to develop this. Is that okay? Does that fit with you? Then goes back to the squad and says, okay, squad, this is kind of the orders that we have from the tribe lead that we need to do. How are we going to pick this apart? And if it is well organized, and in the squad, everybody is available, all the knowledge is present to do so. Obviously, that's not always the case. There are always gray areas, and there may be conflicts between squads, and those need to be solved. But you try to minimize that as much as possible by having all these functions in the squad, and having the product owner work with the squad about setting the daily priorities.
Yeah, it's almost as if the product owner is a facilitator for the squad. Doesn't really have too much formal authority over the squad members, right?
No, so formal authority is very limited in these organizations. Huh? So in the squad, people are kind of equal, and product owner is just a role that you have. Huh? And others have the role to program things, and everybody is respected for their own role and can do in their role what they're good at. And for the rest, it's teamwork. So there's no real authority in that sense that there is another hierarchical layer saying, okay, there's also a team leader or something like that. No, that's not what happens. It's really, you need to have a good team that can collaborate.
Okay, we're coming to the top of the hour, so I know you want to go through sections 3, 4, and 5. Maybe we take a few more questions and then we give people a 5-minute break.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so I'll continue with questions along the Spotify model first, and I'll pull back questions that are asked earlier in the session. So Jürgen asked, how does budget allocation and portfolio level coordination happen? How does that work at the tribe lead level?
Yeah, actually budget is relatively simple, because a tribe is 150 persons, and that is the budget. So actually that's very, very stable. The trick is that you don't know what you're going to get for the budget. Eh? You know you have 150 people, but what those 150 people are going to do in the tribe over the next quarter or even over the next year, you don't know, because they can develop all kinds of things. So that's different from other projects, where we often have projects funded, and then the project needs more budget, and then you get budget overruns, etc. And you never know, if you're going to make your overall budget at the end of the year or not. But here the budget is fixed. It's 150 persons, and that's what the tribe has to work with. And there may be some other budgets around it for specific projects, etc. But basically, it's quite simple. The portfolio planning, yeah, that is a big issue. And that is actually what they also do in those quarterly business reviews. That's also where you need to set the priorities. And that's also where I think Spotify had problems, specifically if you look at new strategic projects that need to be added to the portfolio planning. Yeah, it's going to be very difficult if all those teams are doing their own work. So you need to have some hierarchy in place there, with the board saying, okay, this is a strategic project that has to be implemented by all tribes. Maybe privacy could be such a thing when we had the new privacy laws over here in the European Union. And then, that is an overall project, and that has priority in the portfolio planning. So you need to look on a quarterly basis, go through your portfolio planning and see, okay, do we really have the resources to do all this? And if we don't, then the hierarchy kicks in, and the hierarchy has to decide which projects have priority over other projects.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions on holocracy and self-organization, but I'll leave that for the...
Yeah, let's leave that for the next one. Otherwise, we're going to run too much out of time, I think. There's maybe one thing I wanted to add because of the implementation issues that people raised. And that's just briefly, people say, how do we get management buy-in, resistance of staff? How do we break through the silos, mindset change? That was what people mentioned. I made some quick notes when you mentioned them. Those are all very good points. And there are two things that ING did. And one is they actually fired a lot of people and hired a lot of new ones. So they hired people that could work within the Spotify model. So you get rid of some of the legacy mindset. And at the same time, they also focused a lot on culture and behavior. So there was a new cultural program. And really everybody is trained in the norms and values about how to work as an ING employee, but also in this organization. How do you do that? That's how they brought about the mindset change. So one is really changing the people. And the other one is a lot of training in terms of culture and norms and values that you want in these organizations.
All right, we have one last question on the Spotify model, then maybe we take a 5-minute break. Would that work?
Yeah.
Okay, so Florian asks, how does the Spotify model separate the transitional work from the operational work?
How does it separate from the operation?
Yeah, transitional work and the operational work. Florian, if you want to explain more, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I'm still trying to get the hang of the Spotify model, but what I see is product management. That's not actual people doing banking work. That's people producing a future state based on feedback from the operational side. So I'm understanding that what we're seeing here is just the team that creates new products, but it's not the team that actually works with the products in terms of customer contact or real operations.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. So what you would like to have is basically end-to-end responsibility would be ideal. Huh? So if you build it, then you own it and you operate it. Huh? They're moving towards that model. So what you want to have is that people who build the software also have to work with it and also have to maintain it. And they have done that to quite some extent in ING, if I recall correctly, because that solves a lot of problems. Huh? In the old organizations, somebody would build it, but then they would throw it over the wall and somebody else would have to maintain it. And then it turns out that maintenance actually is very difficult to do because it wasn't built for maintenance. So they have built that in, that end-to-end responsibility. But in some areas and in some organizations, obviously, that's easier to do than others. But it is what you want to strive for, to have that all connected. So that's a good question. It is the ideal situation, but it's not only possible to some extent in many organizations.
Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. So now it's 4:58 Singapore time.
Yeah.
So we'll come back at 5:03. Stretch your legs, drink water, Relax yourself, stand up if you need to.
Yeah. I'll see you in 5 minutes.
We've got about 1 minute and 30 seconds left. So if you can hear me and you're away from your computer, time to start coming back.
Trying to. Just going through some of the comments still, see if I can. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so there are still quite a few questions that haven't been answered. So I'm gonna, in the interest of time, get up.
Yeah, I think we cannot do them.
Yeah, let's do them at the end.
Yeah.
And if you don't get your question answered in this session, you can always reach out to Ard-Pieter. The information will be made available as to how you can contact him. We're also going to provide you with this deck of slides as well as the recording for this session. So if you don't want your face to be recorded, yeah, you can keep your cameras off. We will have a breakout session later on for a short period of time. So just be ready for that. Okay, 5 minutes is up.
Okay, thanks, Gerald. And indeed, I don't think it will be possible to answer all the questions, but I'm happy to answer them offline. So just send them to me, and really don't hesitate to do that. I want to say a little bit about self-organization, because it's a word that also is very popular at the moment. And one of my favorite management gurus is Sumantra Ghoshal, and he's one of the first persons who also said that, well, maybe the command and control model that we've used so long in organizations is outdated, and maybe we should look much more to what he called purpose, process, and people, to engage people, and instead of seeing them as just an employee, as a part of production capacity, yeah, to see them as people in their entirety, and make use of all the different skills that they have, and to engage them. And yeah, the question is, what is self-organization? There's I think a lot of different definitions out there. And in general, it just means that you decentralize authority throughout the organization. So it means that people, even at low levels in the organization, can make their own decisions about important things. So any move to fewer hierarchical layers is basically at the same time a move towards self-organization. Now, if you look at most forms of self-organization, they do not go that far. So you can basically have three levels. You can say, okay, people can set their own goals. That would be self-organization. Well, that rarely happens. I've hardly seen that. You could also say, well, people decide the organization structure. So they decide which departments you have in the organization. Again, you hardly see that. I will have an example about that later on. Holocracy does that to some extent, but usually the goal and the overall structure of the organization are still set by management. So most self-organization is actually self-management. It is that people can have, an amount of work to do, and they can share among themselves how they're going to do it, when they're going to do it, and who's going to do it. And a famous example here in the Netherlands is an organization for home care. So they care for the elderly who live still at home, for example, or people who are long-term ill. And a team of nurses will just have one part of the city, and they are responsible for managing all those patients, or for helping all the patients in that part of the city. And they jointly determine who's going to do what. And it's not the boss that says, okay, you have to go to Mrs. A and you have to go to Mr. B. And today I don't want you to do some administrative work. No, there's a team. They know they have to do everything that happens in that part of the city, that has to be done in that part of the city. And they decide among themselves who's going to do what. And it's very successful and very effective. So you can do with without some management, but not without every management. I thought another favorite management guru of mine is Dilbert. I like this little cartoon. As requested, I did a risk management assessment, and I concluded that there was no risk of any management. So the manager is not doing his job very well, apparently. Do you have anything to add? And then the manager says, well, I'll get back to you. He has to think about it. But, so this is a case where indeed, there's no use for management. And I think in general, in a lot of organizations, there are too many management layers. At the same time, there's also a bit of a hype saying, okay, we can do without all managers. Well, I don't believe that either. Management still can have an important role. For example, in avoiding calamities, and that's also the traditional role of management. The first managers in the commercial organization actually emerged in the American railroads. Railroads were very dangerous in the 1840s. And here you see an old picture of a railroad accident. Trains would collide. Sometimes there would be maintenance on the railroad, and still a train would go over the track. So a lot of things were going wrong in those organizations. And that is when the first middle manager actually was appointed. And the task of that middle manager was to go to all the departments in the railroad and ask them, okay, what are your plans? Do you want to do maintenance on this track? Do you want to have a train ride over it at a certain time? There's the marketing department wants something done because there's a special event in another town and they want to have extra trains. And the managers had to get all that information from all those different departments, bring it together, and then come up with a schedule about when trains could actually leave safely and safely arrive at their destination. And that was actually the first middle manager that was appointed in 1841. And so management also has a role in saving people's lives. So doing away with all management may not be the solution. One popular form nowadays with few management layers is the Holocracy model. Here we have an implementation in bol.com. Bol.com is kind of the Amazon or the Alibaba of the Netherlands. And basically what they've done, what they are doing is that they have different stores. So you can have let's say the bookstore or the clothing store online, but let's take the bookstore as an example. And the bookstore is really run by a team of people, and there's no real team lead there. Everybody has a different job. So somebody may do the finances, somebody may do the website, somebody may think about the marketing. Which book should we put up on the site as recommended reading? Everybody has their own role, and within their role, they can decide whatever they want. So, for example, if I decide that I don't know, gardening is going to be important in the next month because the weather is going to be better, so everybody wants to work in their garden. Then maybe if I'm responsible for the book selection and the marketing, I may put as a recommendation on the website, okay, buy this book on gardening, because I believe with my marketing knowledge that the people in the country will want to buy that at that moment in time. But maybe there are other people in the store who have different ideas about that. But it's organized in such a way that if I'm responsible for, let's say, the pick of the month of the book, then I can do that. And then I'm trusted with my knowledge and my skills that I picked the right book. And there's nobody who can object to that. So if my colleague says, well, why did you pick a book about gardening as the book of the month? You should have picked a book about politics because there are elections or something like that. I mean, we don't have those discussions. If it's my role to do the marketing and to do the pick of the book of the month, then I do it and nobody can object to that. And that avoids a lot of hassle that you normally have in meetings where everybody's going to interfere with everybody else's decisions. But here it is, if you have the role and you have the budget to do something, and that can sometimes even be big, like buying a new machine in a factory, for example, where I've seen this model work. There's somebody on the shop floor who was responsible for the machines, actually could buy a new machine herself, provided, of course, that she gets some advice from finance and from the experts, but then it's her decision to buy that particular machine. And others cannot object to that, unless it really harms them in their role. So if I would buy a machine that would make it impossible for the person responsible for product quality to come up with a good product, yeah, then we have a problem. And then our roles actually collide. But as long as we don't have a reasonable objection, if I can still be responsible for good product quality and deliver good product quality with the machine that she selected, then I cannot make an objection to her decision to buy that particular machine, even if I would have preferred another machine. And that is what we call decision-making by consent. And that's a very important element in Holocracy. If you have the role, you're entitled to make the decision, and the others will have to consent with your decision. unless it really makes it impossible for them to do their job right. And that consent principle means that decision making can go very, very fast. You don't have to argue a lot about what is the right decision. So it's consent decision making. It's very decentral. The store team in Bol can do it. The shop floor worker in a factory can make their own decisions. Each individual has several roles. So that can be, if I'm working in the bookstore, it can be that my role is pick the book of the month. But maybe I also have a role in human resource. I don't know, organize the office party or something like that. People can have up to 10 or 20 of those different roles. So that's quite a lot. And there is a little bit of hierarchy in the sense that usually there are 3 levels. Each store team, we call that a circle. Well, there may be a middle management level above that, a middle management circle, and then a top management circle. What the top management circle does is they elect somebody to represent them at the lower level circle. And from the middle management circle, also somebody is elected to represent middle management in this case, the store team in the operational level. But it also works the other way around. From the store team, we elect somebody to represent our store in the middle management circle. So that is somebody who sits in and participates in the meetings of middle management and can bring our viewpoint of the store across in the middle management level. And the middle management team elects somebody to represent them at the top management level. And in that way, you have a good information flow, not just from the top down, which often is okay organized in organizations, but also from the bottom up. And that's called a double bind. So it goes from top down, but also from, let's say, the shop floor to top management. We have a good information flow. Now, this model works very well when you have more routine operations and similar tasks that keep occurring. Like I said, choosing the book of the month, for example, comes back every month and is quite a routine operation. But to speed that up and to get some entrepreneurship there on the lower levels of the organization is, that's what Holocracy works very well for. Here again, similar to the Spotify model, there's a lot of attention for the culture and the values. You know, how do we behave? What do we expect from you in this organization? I won't go into this too deep, but if you Google the Netflix culture, you will come across some articles and slide packs about how Netflix does this. And they've really come up with a very good system to make sure everybody has the right behavior and has internalized the values of Netflix. And you see similar things in Bol.com, and I also mentioned it at ING. These types of self-organization really depend usually also on people having the values that you want them to have, because that ensures that they make a decision that is in line with the strategy of your organization. Well, I think if you listen to my story, you will also have heard that there are quite some conditions for self-management. And in a minute, we're gonna do a poll about this, and I will ask you the question, which of these conditions for self-management are not present in your organization. And I think all of these need to be present in an organization before they can implement self-management or self-organization. I made a short summary of them in the book. The list is a bit longer, but I think this is the core. So you need to have a clear and internalized vision. People need to have those values incorporated, know what the organization stands for. There still need to be clear tasks and mandates. Like in the bookstore example, my mandate is to pick the book of the month. And that can have quite some consequences for revenue that you get from book sales. That's your task, that's your mandate. That still needs to be very clear. People need to have access to relevant information. So if I want to make the decision on the book of the month, maybe I need to know the history of what sold last year in that particular month, because maybe in some seasons, some books sell better than in other seasons. I need to have access to that information. So your information systems need to be up to date and accessible. We talk about non-fatal decisions. Yeah, one of the things where self-organization doesn't work is when that can lead to fatalities. So, for example, well, imagine you're in an airplane and the crew comes in, and then you hear somebody ask, "Okay, guys, who wants to fly the plane today?" That's not what you want. Huh? The risk is too high. So, in an airplane, you have a crew, and it is clear that the captain is the boss, and that's the person who makes the decision. And if we're going to leave that to self-organization, it's going to be dangerous. There can be fatal consequences. Assignment of management tasks to teams. Yeah, if you take out the management layer, that doesn't mean that the management tasks disappear, because who's going to fire people, for example? Who's going to do the budgeting or the staff planning? The team has to do that themselves, and not all teams like that. And if you don't assign those tasks to teams, then yeah, gaps are going to occur and things are going to go wrong. That also means you need effective team behavior and feedback on a team level. So effective team behavior can be, yeah, if my colleague doesn't do his or her job very well, I need to say that. And that's often a scary thing to do to your direct colleague. And certainly in traditional organizations, you're not used to do that. You know, what people do if the colleague doesn't do the work right, they go to their boss and complain about the colleague, and then the boss deals with it. Well, that's not effective team behavior in a self-organization structure. You need to organize for knowledge sharing, like in the ING example, where we have the the different forms of knowledge sharing in the chapters. Teams need to be able to function independently, because if what I do in my team also affects another team, then we need to coordinate between teams, and that means we're going to have a lot of meetings, or we need a manager above that, and that's what we don't want. We also need a change in leadership, so managers need to trust that their people are going to make the right decisions. And for traditional managers, that's hard to do. They need to let go of a lot of their control instinct. And probably most important is that teams need to have the will to do it. I think if a team wants to be self-organizing, then already the implementation is going to be so much easier. Huh? Do people have the will to do it? Do they think it's fun to work in that type of organization? That will make it much more a success than when manager says, okay, as of today, you're self-organizing. That's probably not going to work, even though I've seen a lot of bosses implement it in that way. So Gerald, perhaps you can put up the poll. Huh? So the question is, which of these conditions for self-organizations are not present in your organization? And indeed, you know, if you're not currently in an organization, just use an organization you've been part of, or if you're a consultant, maybe you have a client organization you can answer it for. And you can click on more of the options, huh? Because several of those can occur. And during the break, I also saw somebody who said, well, 150 people in a tribe, that's kind of the Dunbar number. Then you're exactly right. I see a lot of organizations that have self-organization. It works well with departments from 150 to about 200 people, because that's kind of the number that you can still have in your mind, that you know, that you can know. Our brain cannot, you know, have more people and faces in our memory than about that number. That's a number that was proposed by I think it was a social psychologist called Dunbar, and we call that the Dunbar number. So and for self-organization, it's important that people know each other. That's otherwise it doesn't work.
There are roughly 6 more people who haven't voted. I'll just wait a couple of seconds more.
Okay, just wait 5 seconds and then we'll...
Okay. The results.
Okay, good. Thank you. So what we see, the highest scoring, yes, we always blame the managers. Huh? But actually it is an issue. And certainly if you have managers that are have made their career in a hierarchical organization, for them it can be very, very difficult to make the transition. And that's also why ING actually said goodbye to a lot of people and really looked at whether the people they still kept, whether they would fit in the new model. So it is definitely important because a manager should also let a team make their own mistakes, because they have to learn from that, and that's how they grow and how they improve. I see other high scores here in effective team behavior, clear and internalized vision. I think those indeed also come, I see that a lot. It doesn't surprise me that this score's high. The internalized vision, a lot of organizations always say, yeah, our culture is so important, etc. But if you look at it in real life, they don't pay that much attention to the culture and the norms and values that they expect from their people. So that is a problem. I think the lowest scoring is knowledge sharing can be organized. So apparently, I think in the organizations you have in mind, knowledge sharing is something that you can organize. And indeed, I think more knowledge management techniques have come out over the past years that would make that easier. I think what is important when I work with clients and I show this list, it really brings them down to earth. They sometimes have really unrealistic expectations about what their organization can do. And if we run through this list with clients that think about self-organization, it always delivers a lot of debate, and it helps them to identify a lot of areas that they need to improve before they can implement a self-organization. So that's why this list is always very, very useful. Okay, I'm also looking at the clock, Gerald, but maybe we have time for 1 or 2 questions, and if there still are some.
Yeah, I think the most relevant right now is Florian's question. Is there any difference of being able to move into self-organization across different cultures, not your culture?
Okay, across different cultures, national cultures, she means.
I don't know, Florian, maybe you want to explain?
Yes, correct, national countries.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And actually also, I forgot to mention that also at the ING case, because somebody mentioned country differences as well. Yes, interestingly, if you look at the Spotify model, ING is now implementing that in Germany. They first did it in the Netherlands, but the Netherlands has a very low regard for hierarchy. We are very egalitarian, whereas Germany, which is right next door, is quite hierarchical. It's very different, and they're implementing it there as well. And the question seems to be more that, can we find the right people in another country to work in that model? And there are always people in any country that can work in such a model. But of course, I think there are limits. There are countries that are much more hierarchical, and their self-organization will be more difficult to implement than in other countries. And I'm trying to follow a little bit the experiments that are going on in other countries, but I just don't have enough observations at the moment to give a definite conclusion about that. My feeling is that it is possible in many countries, but in some countries it will take much longer than in others. And it is certainly a question of finding the right people that fit with a self-organization model in specific countries. It's not, you cannot copy paste it from one country to the next. You have to think about either phasing it, taking a longer implementation time, finding the right people, and maybe let it grow over time in more hierarchical countries than in less hierarchical countries. National culture definitely has an impact.
Since we are on that, I'm going to circle back to Bill's question earlier. Not sure whether you know the answer to this. Do you know of Caterpillar's implementation of Holocracy in China?
Implementation in China, I don't think I have an example of that. No.
Okay, got it.
But we will go into the Rendanheyi model in a few minutes, which is also very much focused on self-organization. So, yeah, things
okay.
are possible.
So just one more.
For that question. Yeah.
Yeah, one more in this section. So Mahesh asked earlier, it seems that looking at org forms should be an important agenda for leaders in the post-COVID era. So from your experience, are you seeing a spike in interest in this particular subject?
So interest in this model because of the COVID?
In the various self-organizing forms or models.
In the self-organizing, yes. Yeah, I do see it. I've been talking to quite some companies recently also about that. I also had a student doing his master thesis on the impact of COVID in a couple of organizations. He mainly looked at professional service organizations, so like consultancies and lawyers and those kind of organizations. So there it already may be a bit easier because of the nature of the job. But actually, most of those firms said, yes, we are looking at it much more. Actually, some of them said, why didn't we do it earlier? Because a lot of, let's say, more traditional bosses said, well, I always had those people here in the office. I could see what they were doing. They would walk in for all kinds of questions. And even questions that I thought, okay, you know that, why do I have to answer that? And now, because they're working at home, they're not asking those questions anymore. And still things go very well. So maybe those managers say, I should also change my attitude. There are quite some that see this as a learning experience. They say there's a lot of coordination that actually wasn't necessary, or people ask for a lot of approval for things, probably because they don't want to risk making the wrong decision or something like that, even though they know that 99% sure what they want to do is okay. And they still come to me for that decision. And now they don't do that anymore. So yeah, we see that it kind of happens automatically. They're not implementing these models formally at the moment, but it does get them to think about their own role and say, okay, maybe I need to be more clear about, when you have to come to me, and maybe I can leave much more to the team than I did before. So we need to start thinking about, how are we going to structure this? Can we take these lessons from COVID with people working at home, making their own decisions? Yeah, can we make that sustainable over the longer run, also when COVID is no longer there, hopefully in some time. So it certainly has led to, I think, a surge of interest in models of self-organization.
All right, thanks for that. Just watching the time, so maybe we go on with 4 and 5 first, and then we come back to...
Yes, and I actually can combine those. What I'll do is I'll just skip these quotes and this one too, and talk a bit more about the platforms and ecosystems, and that will also, I think, set up the discussion for the Rendanheyi model. I think everybody will know platform organizations like Google and Facebook and Amazon. You have Grab as a very well-known example in Singapore that started out as a taxi service, but now has branched out in all kinds of other areas, food delivery and streaming and the like. So those platform-based organizations is also a very big trend. And they actually thrive on what we call ecosystems. So it's not just the platform, but there are a lot of parties that work via the platform. So for example, if you are a taxi driver and you work with Grab, then you are in the Grab ecosystem. You may still be an independent taxi driver, or maybe have your own car and only use that as a taxi in the evenings or something like that. But then you're part of the Grab ecosystem. There may also be app developers that develop apps for Facebook or that develop games for Facebook, and they're in the Facebook ecosystem. So the entire idea of these platforms is that they offer a set of shared assets. So they have a certain technology or databases or standards. And app developers or even an individual taxi driver can make use of those different assets, those technologies, algorithms, etc., to deliver their own services via that platform. And all those partners in the ecosystem, they're called complementers in the literature. So organizations that make use of that platform and develop their own apps, services, or products based on the platform. And the platform is really dependent on having a very good ecosystem. If you have a lot of people driving their taxi or a lot of people developing games on your platform, then you will attract more clients. And if there are more clients, then of course you're more interesting for a game developer to put his game on your platform instead of that platform of the competitor. So there really is a mutual dependency between the platform and the ecosystem. And that also means that even powerful ecosystems can not always make their decisions the way they like it. You may have followed in the press the debate around Apple, where we have some of the game developers that are really now kind of rioting against Apple because they find that Apple takes too much of their money. And Apple will need to take that in consideration somehow, because if all the game developers run away because they think it's too expensive to work via the Apple platform, then Apple will be left without games and it will be a very unattractive platform. So there's mutual dependency, and certainly for a lot of the online things like games, there are standardized contracts with platforms that are used. So everybody pays, I think, 30% of their revenue to Apple or something like that if you do anything on the Apple platform. Now, for the book, we've looked at one platform called Booking.com, which you probably know, the biggest hotel site in the world. And actually, when we went there, we thought, well, this is going to be a complete online thing. They're going to communicate with their ecosystem, their hotels, or online. They're going to give them data about, which marketing tricks work and which segment of customers are going to come to their hotel, those kind of things. But actually, when we went there, it was very interesting to see that Booking.com still invested a lot in face-to-face contact with hotels. So they actually went to hotels to see how they use the Booking.com website. They invite hotels to open lab sessions at the Booking.com office. So in Booking.com has a new functionality they have built and they want to test it with some clients. They ask a hotel to come over and say, okay, we have this functionality. What do you think about it? Would you use it? How would you use it? How should we improve it? So there's still a lot of face-to-face management to keep those partners happy. Shadow sessions is another thing. That's just where they sit with their own customer teams and just listen in to, you know, what questions are hotels asking to our call center, and does that lead to a new functionality that we need to develop for those hotels. So even though it's an online business, there's still a lot of face-to-face interaction to make sure that they build the right functionality. Now, I think in the COVID area for Booking.com, it's more difficult. And you see that now the relation with the hotels is getting really under strain, because we're talking about, you know, who gets what of the little revenue that there still is, and then the relationship gets very difficult. So in the COVID area, we see that actually some online platforms do very well, especially the Apples and Amazon and Facebook that have a pure online model, or that do shopping, have a shopping offering. But if you're a Booking.com and you work in the tourist sector at the moment, it's very difficult. And it's the same for taxi services and a couple of other platforms. So platforms do not make you immune to these kind of economic crises. Some of them profit from it, but for some it's really difficult. And then the question is, how do you deal with all your ecosystem partners? Because if a company like Booking.com really treats the partners badly at this moment, then, you know, will they come back when the crisis is over, or will they go to a competing platform? And maybe if you can keep them happy during the crisis, you will have a good relationship with them, and they will come back after the crisis. So it's really very difficult to work with that. And maybe, and that's briefly for the chat, I don't know whether you know any organizations that have actually acted very responsibly in the Corona crisis. So some examples of that. I'd be interested to hear those, so you can ask them in the chat, or put them in the chat. And we see some companies that really do things that make it very difficult for their partners to survive. And for example, they increase the terms of payment for suppliers. If they used to pay them within 30 days, they now say, we will take 2 months to pay you. And then you just put the problem with the supplier. And obviously, when finance runs out, I can understand that you do that, but whether that's in the long term a good solution, of course, is a big question. I think one good example, actually I can access let me check. If I do it like this, I can access the chat, so I can see it a little bit. I see Microsoft that treated partners really well. I think they were an example. Another one I came across was Cisco. Cisco has a lot of sales targets with their partners. And they said, okay, partners, don't worry too much about the sales targets this year if you don't make them. So that helps those partners, puts a bit of the pressure of them. But he also said, okay, partners, if you have nothing to do at the moment, or your staff have nothing to do, we have some good training programs that we want to open up to you. So if you have staff that want to join our training programs, our online training programs, you can do that. And that, of course, is a smart move, because then you invest in your partner network, you upgrade their skills, they learn the latest about the new technologies, and when the market comes back again, they can actually give better advice and probably sell more of the Cisco products than they could previously. So it's really an investment also in their ecosystem. Okay, I'm just looking at the time. I think we should just go on to the Rendanheyi.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Example, because that basically builds also on if I have to click now, that's the difficulty. If I Yes, you can still see my screen. Yeah. And Rendanheyi is actually kind of the latest that has gotten a lot of attention. And the slogan of Rendanheyi is from walled garden to rainforest. You already see the ecosystem metaphor here in rainforest. And this was actually a metaphor that was introduced by Zhang Rumin, the CEO of Rendanheyi. And basically he says, you know, that platform and ecosystem model that I just explained, we need that. All organizations are going to transform towards that model. And he actually took a step further, because how are you going to implement it in your organization? And hire, of course, is very much in traditional products, like white goods, washing machines, and kitchen appliances, those kind of things. So you can think, okay, what can you do with that? Well, he made a very radical decision. He said, we really need to unleash entrepreneurship in our organization to profit from Internet of Things technology. And so what he did was introduce the Rendanheyi model, and Rendanheyi stands for employee-user goal alignment. And he radically decentralized the organization. And he said, I'm going to split up hire in 20 different platforms over 5 areas. And I'm going to split up the organization in no less than 4,000 micro enterprises. And each of those enterprises is connected to a certain user community. So the user is the leader. And so if I produce washing machines, you know, my user community will consist of people who use washing machines. And those can be laundrettes, but those could also be individuals owning a washing machine themselves. And we want to have constant feedback from those people about how they use our product. And in that way, we can improve our product. And so how does hire make a profit? Well, the value of those micro enterprises, you know, that increases, and that's highest profit. And people working in those enterprises are also co-entrepreneurs. Some of them may be co-owners of the micro enterprise, so they have invested in it. So they get rewarded based on that. And you really get rewarded, paid based on the value you create for your users. And you get a minimum fixed salary, but really, if you want to have a full salary, then it is important that you create value for the users and you can show that. Well, there is some global leadership committee for coordination across those things. I won't go into that too much. All business processes are highly digitized, because you can understand that also between those various micro enterprises, there may be a lot of contracts, because one micro enterprise delivers to another micro enterprise. And some of them work internally, and so they have internal clients, but also quite some are focused externally, and they deliver immediately to a certain market segment. So to administrate all that, you need blockchain, because otherwise you cannot keep track of all the contracts. Hire used to have some 12,000 middle managers, and huge, and those middle managers had to choose. So either you would become an entrepreneur, you start up a micro enterprise and you invest in it, or you leave the company. So it's a relatively tough system. You work with the system, or you have to leave. So people are rewarded based on a value-added statement. I've given that on the left side. So they measure various variables that you have to score on, and if you score okay on those variables, so do you have enough engaged users, for example, in your micro enterprise? Do you really deliver value over the lifetime of a product or a customer? You know, if you're able to show you can do that, then you deliver value, and basically you also increase your salary. And then it works, that they become very innovative. I've just given some examples here. They've developed a refrigerator that notifies you when your food gets past consumption dates. I never thought I would need that, but with their technology, they can do it. I'll just pick out another one. You know, if you're in your kitchen and you want to cook something, you can have a virtual cooking class. You immediately have access to that because there are screens and they're very easy to navigate. You can say, okay, I want to cook this and this dish. Give me the recipe. How do I make it? And even the refrigerator can suggest recipes based on what you have stored in the fridge. So there's a lot of new services using Internet of Things that you can use, that you can develop, and that nobody thought about before. But because you're in a micro enterprise and you have direct contact with the client, you hear a lot of things that get you thinking about new innovations. So what are the core principles? Well, each micro enterprise has a leading goal. So a leading goal can be, well, we want to be #1 over 3 years in the United Kingdom in the market for vacuum cleaners. So that's really an ambitious goal that you work towards. Those micro enterprises, it's very decentral. They all have their own responsibility. They're really run as if they're independent companies within the overall higher company. Focus on entrepreneurship and really user focus, user paid. If you don't create value for the user, then yeah, you have no value for the organization. And I think they allow you about 3 months to not add value and give you some time to find a place where you can add value. But if after that you haven't done it, then you're politely asked to leave the company. Now the question is, this is in China, can you also apply this internationally? Well, they are applying some of these principles in the US, in Germany, also in Japan. But here you see the cultural differences, coming back to the previous question. You cannot do this in every country to the same extent. For example, in Japan, there's still lifetime employment is for people is still standard. Yeah, that makes it not so easy to implement this model. But also in Germany, there are labor laws that, and in America as well, that limit the extent to which you can really have user-paid people on the payroll. And there are just minimum wage requirements and other laws that do not make that possible. But there are ways of working around it and getting close to that system. So it will be very interesting to see over the coming years how far you can apply this model in different cultures. They've had some success already in the US, but the full model isn't implemented there yet. It has some disadvantages. It's complex, right? With 4,000 micro enterprises. Loss of coherence can be a problem. Because people can start up micro enterprises wherever they see an opportunity. And the question is, do you want that? Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe if we look back at it and 5 years from now, you think, okay, now what do we have? We have all these loose individual products. Why are we still an overall company called Hire? Does that still add value? And of course, there's little security for personnel. They are entrepreneurs, they are at risk. And their income really depends very directly and to a very large extent on their own performance. So whether it's always nice for the individual person working for hire is a question. Some people may thrive in that environment. I'm sure that for some people it's very difficult. Well, there's a little bit about how he transformed it. And he said, it looks like a radical model, but actually, if you create a pilot, then people will find out how easy it often is to do, because a lot of management also holds people back in their entrepreneurship skills. So if you get rid of it, you will see that a lot of people will also really bloom and blossom in that environment. The financial motivation is really important. And exposing people to the market. And I think that is a strong point. If you go to big hierarchical firms and you think about, how many people in those firms actually talk to a real life client, it's probably a very low number, I'm afraid. And talking to a client is still, the strongest source of information for, I think, for people to start to innovate. Gerald, I'm also looking to the clock. What do you think? I still have the John Deere example, but I think we have about 5 minutes left. Is that true?
About 7 minutes.
Yeah, maybe is it better to take questions, or shall I go rapidly through the John Deere example, or maybe it's better to take some questions, huh?
Yeah, I think that would be better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because John Deere is basically more asking them to apply the higher method to another organization, but I think questions are more relevant now.
Yeah. Okay, so we had a question. What do you mean with project-driven organizations? Okay, this was when we were still going through the Spotify model. So project seems to conflict with Agile.
Yeah, so project, okay, what I mean by that, good question, I should have explained that. So with projects, I mean that you can really define individual innovation projects that one of those squads, one of those teams can work on for a while. So you don't, and those projects can change. There may be 4 or 5 projects in 1 year, and each of those projects can be different. One may be about making the website, giving that a better look and feel, and maybe giving more information to clients, maybe developing something that clients can pay back their mortgage more easily online, for example, without having to go through all kinds of difficult processes. All of these can be small individual innovation projects. And if you have an organization in which a lot of those type of projects exist, then the Spotify model works very well. And often that means that you have an IT environment in which you apply it, because in an IT or in a platform organization as well, you can think of thousands of small optimization and improvement projects you can do at any one point in time.
Okay, we have another question here. This is from Wolf. How much is Apple really working in an agile manner on a strategy scale? Going back to the headquarters and their shapes, they seem very different.
Yeah. Actually, for Apple, I don't know exactly. I think my guess would be that they will be agile in the sense of their operations and the maintenance of their platform. But the strategy question is an important one. And it also ties in actually to the Rendanheyi example and to all of these examples of more self-organization and less hierarchy. The problem is always, what are we going to do with the bigger strategic projects? Because those are not picked up automatically by self-organizing teams. The self-organizing teams often have the focus on their job, which can be quite narrow sometimes. And if there is a big strategic initiative that has to be implemented, then the question is always, how are we going to do that? And if you don't organize that separately, then maybe you do a lot of good things in the short run, but the longer run projects that are going to take effect in 2 or 3 years, they're not going to happen in your organization. So there are 2 solutions. One of them is kind of the quarterly business review that I showed in Spotify. And actually, Spotify has implemented also a model like that. Or I showed it in ING. Spotify has a bit of a different model now. But that's where they look really at the big bets for the longer term. And then the question is, what are we going to do with the big bets? Are we going to embed them in our standard organization so that we work on them just as split them up in small separate projects and build it from there, which you can do? Or are we going to create an internal startup, or we find an external startup to do those strategic initiatives for us? And that's often what you see. And of course, that's also what Apple does. And also if you look at Facebook, I'll take Facebook, the real strategic innovation, they just bought Instagram. And Instagram is, I don't know, perhaps going to be bigger than the traditional Facebook is. So you see that those companies are really balancing that. Self-organization is tricky for the strategic projects. You have to think about, can I embed some of those strategic projects in my own organization? If not, do I organize it internally in a different venture? Or am I going to acquire other ventures that already have something like that and set us on the right strategic course for the longer term.
Yeah, I suppose that's if they don't have the bandwidth, or if they do have the bandwidth, they take it on internally, right? If they don't have,
Yes.
they might look for external. My own question here. So, how does this kind of fit in with Stanley McChrystal's team of teams when we have dependencies across self-organizing teams?
Yeah, yeah. So that's I think that's what you get. Huh? Actually, what you want to do is you want to avoid the team of teams. Huh? So the ideal situation in the Spotify model is that each team can act completely independently of the other teams. Reality always gets in the way because somehow there are always interdependencies. And when there are a lot of those interdependencies, for example, when you don't have your IT system in order, then indeed you need a team of teams, or you go to, for example, SAFe, the Scaled Agile Framework, as an implementation method for gaining at least some of the benefits of working Agile. But maybe you do not reach the full effect that the Spotify model will get you. So there are a lot of implementation models for Agile. We also explain some of them in the book. I think Spotify is kind of the most far-reaching, but it does imply, or it does have the assumption that there are not too many dependencies between teams, so that you do not need teams of teams coordinating on a very large scale, because that will only slow down your development. Obviously, in a lot of organizations that doesn't work, and then you need a SAFe framework, or LESS is another framework, or the teams of teams on a standard basis to coordinate that. You immediately see the limit to that, because how many of those teams of teams can you have? Huh? It's you run the risk of creating a new bureaucracy. One layer of teams is okay, but I've also seen organizations where they're moving into teams of teams, and then all the effect and all the kind of the advantage you can get from working Agile gets lost in and gets bogged down in new meetings that that are just replacing the old management structure.
Manish had a question. How does one start an org form change program? ING undertook the Big Bang approach, but is this the preferred way?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's the preferred way. It's I would almost say it's the way to avoid, probably. It worked at ING because of their long preparation and because they were able to hire so many new people. If you cannot do that, and not many organizations can, because often you're stuck with the people you have, I would always advocate a longer term process. I showed you the example of bol.com, for example. They're really taking a long-term view for implementing these forms of self-organization. And they say, okay, we're just going to start in one part of the organization where teams want it. So actually teams themselves can raise their hand and they say, okay, we now want to become a self-managing team. So if they want it, you already know they have kind of an incentive, or they think it's fun to do, and that already, is half of the implementation if people like it. And then what they do is they slowly give those people more decision-making power over time. So maybe in the first year, they give them a small budget to buy, I don't know, some of their own things or make their own investment in something. And maybe next year they get a bit more and they also start doing their own planning, for example. And maybe a year later, they all also start doing their own human resource processes and they're a full-fledged self-managing team. So they take a longer-term view. And I think what is smart in their way of implementing is that they really allow different parts of the organization to evolve at different speed. And I see there are a lot of managers that really have a big bang approach, whereas maybe some part of your organization is ready for it and another organization isn't. I think if you look at a higher example, that's also pretty radical. They've done it pretty quickly. But again, I think Chinese labor laws allow you to do that. And there's a lot in also Chinese culture that apparently supports that. I think if I would have to do it here in the Netherlands, and we already see it with the German example, the implementation of hire, it takes more time and it's a different implementation process. So I think there are different ways forward. And I think for most companies, so unless you have a very good preparation and you can change an important part of your staff, yeah, then you can do the big bang approach. If you do not meet those two criteria, take a longer term view in implementing.
Thank you. So we're at the top of the second hour, and my personal takeaway is that not only should we know all the various forms, we should know the pros and cons of each form, and also that there are different approaches, whether you take the big bang approach or a different speed kind of approach in implementing these new forms. Is there any final thing that you want to say for our participants here?
No, I think you summarized it very well, Gerald. I here have my conclusions slide, and I think it says that. I certainly think that also in this Corona period, it is very good to take an in-depth look in these different forms and get acquainted with them before you start doing something in your organization. But if you want to do something in an organization, and if you want to start, this is a very good time, because probably implicitly you're already doing quite some things that fit in with some of these new organizational frameworks. So maybe that as a last message. And once again, I've not been able to answer all the questions, I think, but do reach out to me or do it via Pebble Road. I know they're also very helpful, and then it will also end up with me. I'm more than perfectly willing to discuss more of those questions with you. And I just hope this has been very useful for you, just as a big or as a short overview of what's going on in the new organizational forms. And thank you so much for attending this masterclass.
Thank you, Ard-Pieter. I'd like to there's a lot of material to absorb. Thank you for the presentation. The good news is that I think there are new books coming out very quickly. Gary Hamel's book on Holocracy is just out last week. He talks about a lot of the things that we discussed today. He's got many more examples. So I think this way of thinking is going to become more common in the leadership circles, and we hope to see more progress made in this area. Just to remind our participants, this session was recorded, so once we clean it up, it'll be made available to all. Also, Ard-Pieter will be giving us the deck. This also will be shared to you all. So once again, thank you very much, and do keep in touch. The contact details are just there. Thanks a lot, and be safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.